Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button right now. Novak Djokovic unleashed on a reporter during his Australian Open press conference after being asked a question that framed his entire career as chasing other players. First Federer and Nadal, now Alcaraz and Sinner. Make sure to watch until the end, because you'll be amazed at what really happened. Novak Djokovic just reminded a reporter, and the entire tennis world, exactly who the hell he is. And he did it in the most Djokovic way possible. Not with a gracious smile or a diplomatic answer, but with a sharp, pointed response that cut through the bullshit and called out a narrative that's followed him his entire career. A narrative that reduces his achievements, that diminishes his era, that always positions him as the guy chasing someone else rather than the guy everyone else is chasing. The question seemed innocent enough on the surface. A reporter asked Djokovic to compare his early career, when he was chasing Federer and Nadal, to now, when he's chasing Alcaraz and Sinner. Simple comparison question, right? Past versus present. Beginning of career versus end of career. Except it wasn't simple at all, because embedded in that question was an assumption that drove Djokovic absolutely crazy. The assumption that his entire career has been about chasing other people, that he's always been the pursuer, never the pursued, that he's spent 20 years trying to catch up to his rivals rather than dominating the sport in his own right, and Djokovic was not having it. "I'm chasing Yannick and Carlos. In which sense?" He interrupted immediately. You could hear the edge in his voice, the irritation, the barely controlled anger at hearing this narrative again. The reporter tried to clarify. "In terms of winning Grand Slam titles right now. So I'm always the chaser, and I'm never being chased?" Djokovic shot back. The sarcasm was thick, the frustration obvious. "In the meantime, you've won 24 Grand Slams," the reporter acknowledged, realizing they'd stepped in something. "Thanks," Djokovic replied. "It's worth saying that sometimes, right?" That line right there, that's everything. The bite in it, the implication that people conveniently forget his achievements when framing these narratives, that he has to remind people he's won more Grand Slams than anyone in men's tennis history, because apparently that fact gets lost when talking about rivalries and eras. But Djokovic wasn't done. He was just getting started. I find it a little bit disrespectful that you kind of miss out on what happened in between, where the times when I started chasing, as you say, Rafa and Roger, and now that I'm chasing Carlos and Yannick. There's probably about a 15-year period in between where I was dominating the Grand Slams, so I think it's important to put that into perspective. There it is. The heart of his frustration laid bare, because the reporter's question essentially erased 15 years of Djokovic's dominance. It went from young Djokovic chasing Federer and Nadal straight to old Djokovic chasing Alcaraz and Sinner, without acknowledging the massive period in between where Djokovic was the absolute king of tennis, where he was the one everyone else was chasing, where he was breaking records and winning everything in sight. That's what made the question disrespectful. Not that it was rude or mean-spirited, but that it fundamentally misrepresented Djokovic's career by treating his era of dominance as a footnote between two periods of chasing other people. And for someone who's felt disrespected by the media and fans his entire career despite achieving more than almost anyone in tennis history, this was a bridge too far. Let's talk about why this matters so much to Djokovic, because understanding his sensitivity to this narrative requires understanding his entire career arc and how he's been treated compared to his rivals. When Federer and Nadal were dominating in the late 2000s, they were treated like tennis royalty. Federer was the elegant Swiss maestro, the perfect gentleman, the GOAT. Nadal was the fierce warrior, the king of clay, the humble champion. The media loved them, fans adored them. Their rivalry was framed as the greatest thing to ever happen to tennis. And then here came Djokovic, the third guy, the interloper, the one crashing the party. And from day one, he was treated differently. He was the villain, the bad guy, the one interrupting the beautiful Federer-Nadal narrative that everyone loved. It didn't matter that he was just as talented, that his game was just as impressive, that he worked just as hard. He was positioned as the outsider, trying to break into an exclusive club. And that narrative stuck for years. Even as Djokovic started winning Grand Slams, even as he started challenging Federer and Nadal consistently, even as he eventually surpassed them in achievements, the narrative never quite shifted. He was always chasing, always fighting for respect, always having to prove himself in ways that Federer and Nadal never had to. Federer could lose in the first week of a tournament, and people would talk about his grace and longevity. Djokovic could lose, and people would question whether he was finished. Nadal could win on clay, and it was expected, celebrated, beautiful. Djokovic could win the Australian Open for the 10th time, and somehow it felt less special because it was just Djokovic being Djokovic. This double standard has eaten at Djokovic for years. You can hear it in interviews. You can see it in how he responds to criticism. You can feel it in moments like this press conference when someone frames his career in a way that diminishes what he's accomplished. And the thing is, Djokovic has a point. The question really did erase 15 years of dominance. Let's look at the actual numbers to understand why he reacted so strongly. From roughly 2011 to 2023, Djokovic was the most dominant player in men's tennis. Not consistently, not without challenges, but overall, he was the guy. He won Grand Slams on every surface. He held all 4 majors at once. He spent more weeks at number 1 than anyone in history. He won more Grand Slams than Federer or Nadal. He had winning records against both of them. That's not chasing. That's dominating. That's being the hunted, not the hunter. That's creating your own era and legacy rather than existing in someone else's shadow. But the narrative never fully acknowledged that. Even during his peak years, stories about Djokovic often framed him in relation to Federer and Nadal. Can Djokovic catch Federer's Grand Slam record? Djokovic trying to match Nadal's clay dominance. Always positioned as trying to reach their level rather than as having surpassed them. Now, at 37 years old, 38 according to some sources, Djokovic is watching Alcaraz and Sinner establish themselves as the next generation. They split the 4 Grand Slams last year. They're clearly the 2 best players in the world right now. And Djokovic is still competitive, still dangerous, but realistically not the favorite to win major tournaments anymore. That's a hard place to be for any champion. Watching the sport move on without you, feeling your powers fade even as your mind still believes you can compete with anyone, knowing that the era of dominance is over even if you're not ready to fully admit it. And then to have a reporter frame this moment as just continuing the pattern of Djokovic chasing other players, as if nothing changed in between, that's salt in the wound. It's reducing his entire career to being in pursuit of others rather than being pursued himself. Djokovic's response wasn't just about this one question. It was about years of accumulated frustration with how he's been covered, how his achievements have been framed, how his legacy has been discussed. This was all of that spilling out in one tense press conference exchange. "I don't feel like I'm chasing, to be honest," Djokovic said, and you could hear the defiance in his voice, the refusal to accept that narrative even as the evidence might suggest otherwise. Because here's the complicated truth. Djokovic kind of is chasing Alcaraz and Sinner right now. They're better than him at this stage. They're the favorites in Grand Slams. They're the ones expected to win. If Djokovic beats them, it would be an upset, a triumph of experience and wiliness over youth and current form. But acknowledging that reality in those specific terms, chasing, is apparently too much for Djokovic to accept, because it implies a continuation of a narrative he's fought against his whole career, the idea that he's always been in pursuit rather than leading the way. So he pushed back, hard. And in doing so, he reminded everyone of what seems to get forgotten. that he dominated tennis for 15 years, that he holds the all-time men's record for Grand Slam titles, that he was number one in the world for more weeks than anyone in history, that his era of dominance is one of the greatest in any sport. "I'm creating my own history," Djokovic said. "I've been very clear when I say that my intention is always to, in terms of achievements and objectives and results, I want to get to the championship match in every tournament, particularly slams. That's the mindset, not chasing, creating, not pursuing others, building his own legacy." It's a subtle but important distinction in his mind, and based on his reaction, it's a distinction that matters enormously to him. The reporter's question also touched on another sensitive topic for Djokovic, the changing of the guard. Because implicit in asking about chasing Alcaraz and Sinner is the assumption that they're the present and future, and Djokovic is the past, that his time at the top is over, that he's now in the elder statesman phase of his career rather than the champion phase. And again, objectively, there's truth to that. Djokovic is 37 or 38, depending on the source. He's not going to dominate for another decade. His best tennis is probably behind him. The natural cycle of sports means younger players will eventually surpass older champions. But for the champion himself, accepting that reality is incredibly difficult. And having it stated as obvious fact in a press conference question probably stung more than Djokovic wanted to admit. His response revealed that tension, acknowledging that Alcaraz and Sinner are the two best players in the world right now, while also insisting that he's not waving a white flag. Recognizing the natural cycle of sports while rejecting the narrative that positions him as past his prime and chasing the young guns. It's the struggle of every aging athlete. How do you maintain competitive fire and self-belief while also being realistic about where you are in your career? How do you avoid becoming delusional about your chances while also not accepting defeat before you've actually lost? Djokovic is navigating that impossible balance, and this press conference exchange showed how difficult it is, because the competitive part of him rejects the idea that he's chasing anyone, that he's not the favorite, that his time has passed, but the realistic part of him knows that Alcaraz and Sinner are better right now, and that winning another Grand Slam at this age would be an incredible achievement rather than an expectation. The comment about always being the third guy was particularly telling, because that's how Djokovic sees himself and how he's felt treated throughout his career. When Federer and Nadal were dominating, he was the third wheel, the one trying to break into their rivalry and make it a big three instead of a big two. And even though he eventually succeeded and arguably surpassed both of them in overall achievements, the perception of being third never fully went away. He was third in popularity, third in media love, third in fan support. Even when he was winning more than both of them combined, he still felt like he was fighting for recognition that came naturally to Federer and Nadal. Now he's watching Alcaraz and Sinner develop their own rivalry, and he's making a joke about cheering for a third guy because he identifies with that position. It's self-aware and somewhat self-deprecating, but it also reveals the deep-seated feelings about his place in tennis history and how he's been perceived. The media reaction to Djokovic's response has been mixed. Some people think he was absolutely right to push back against a question that erased 15 years of dominance, that the reporter's framing was indeed disrespectful and deserved to be called out, that Djokovic's achievements deserve to be acknowledged rather than glossed over. Others think he overreacted, that the question was reasonable and he's too sensitive about how he's portrayed, that at some point champions need to accept where they are in their careers rather than fighting every narrative they don't like. Both perspectives have merit. The question really did skip over Djokovic's era of dominance in a way that seemed to diminish it. But Djokovic's sharp response also revealed insecurities and sensitivities that might be affecting how he processes his current place in tennis. Former player Greg Rusedski defended Djokovic, saying the response was justified and noting that Djokovic has faced different treatment from the media compared to some other players. That some athletes get more favorable coverage regardless of what they do, while others like Djokovic face more skeptical or negative framing. There's truth to that observation. The media narratives around athletes aren't always fair or consistent. Some players benefit from positive coverage that overlooks their flaws. Others face harsher scrutiny and less generous interpretations of their actions. Djokovic has been in the latter category for most of his career. And after 20 years of feeling like he has to fight for respect despite winning more than almost anyone, it's understandable that he'd be sensitive to questions that seem to continue that pattern. The timing of this exchange is also interesting because Djokovic is in the middle of the Australian Open, trying to win his 11th title at this tournament. He's dealt with walkovers and retirements from opponents, which means he hasn't been tested as much as he might have expected. And now he's facing Sinner in the semifinals, a player who's beaten him 5 straight times. So there's added pressure and perhaps some defensiveness about his current form and chances. The question about chasing Alcaraz and Sinner came at a moment when Djokovic is literally about to face one of them in a match where he'll be the underdog. That context probably made the question feel even more loaded than it might have otherwise. Djokovic's insistence that he's creating his own history rather than chasing others is a mindset thing, a way of framing his current situation that allows him to maintain competitive fire rather than accepting a diminished role. It's probably necessary psychology for competing at this level at his age, because if he fully accepted that he's past his prime and just hoping to occasionally upset the young guys, that acceptance would probably become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He needs to believe he's still creating history, still capable of winning the biggest tournaments, still one of the best players in the world, even if objectively that's not quite true anymore. The press conference moment will be remembered as another example of Djokovic's complicated relationship with the media and with his own legacy. He's achieved more than almost anyone in tennis history, but he still feels like he has to fight for respect. He's won 24 Grand Slams, but people focus on his age and decline rather than his sustained excellence. He's been the most dominant player of his generation, but the narrative often positions him as chasing Federer and Nadal first, Alcaraz and Sinner now. That's frustrating for any champion. And Djokovic's response? Sharp, defensive, but also factually accurate about his accomplishments, captured that frustration perfectly. He's tired of the narrative. Tired of being positioned as the chaser. Tired of having his era of dominance treated as an afterthought in discussions of tennis history. Whether this outburst helps or hurts him going forward remains to be seen. Does it fire him up and help him play better against Sinner? Or does it reveal cracks in his mental armor that opponents can exploit? Does it make people respect his achievements more? Or does it make him look insecure and overly sensitive? Probably some combination of all of the above. But what's certain is that this moment revealed something true about Djokovic that we've always known but don't always acknowledge. For all his achievements, for all his records, for all his dominance, he still feels like he's fighting for respect. Still feels like the third guy. Still feels like his legacy is being diminished or misrepresented. And maybe he's right. Maybe the narratives around him have been unfair. Maybe his achievements deserve more recognition than they get. Maybe he really has been chasing respect his whole career, even while dominating the actual tennis. Or maybe this is just what happens to aging champions who struggle to accept that their time at the top is ending, that the sport is moving on, that the next generation has arrived and they're the past now, regardless of how dominant that past was. Either way, Djokovic reminded everyone in that press conference that he's still here, still competing, still believing he can win, still refusing to accept narratives that diminish what he's accomplished. Still Novak Djokovic, for better or worse. And honestly, that's kind of what makes him compelling. not despite his sensitivity and defensiveness, but because of it, because he cares so deeply about how he's perceived and how his legacy will be remembered, because he's willing to call out questions he finds disrespectful rather than just smiling and giving bland answers, because after 20 years and 24 Grand Slams, he's still fighting. The broader question this raises is about how we discuss athletes' legacies while they're still competing, because Djokovic is in this weird in-between space where his greatest achievements are behind him, but he's still actively playing. So how do we talk about his career? Do we focus on what he's accomplished or what he's currently doing? Do we celebrate the past or analyze the present? The reporter's question tried to do both by comparing early career Djokovic to current Djokovic. But in doing so, it created a framework that Djokovic found offensive because it reduced both periods to chasing rather than acknowledging the dominance in between. It's a reminder that framing matters enormously in how we understand athletes and their careers. And for someone like Djokovic, who spent his entire career feeling like the media frames him less favorably than his rivals, the choice of words and narrative structure in questions isn't just semantics. It's how his legacy gets written. It's how history will remember him. It's whether he'll be viewed as one of the all-time greats or as the guy who was always chasing someone else. That's why he cares so much. That's why he pushed back so forcefully. Because he knows that these narratives have power. They shape perception. They influence how fans and future generations will view his career. And he's determined to make sure his era of dominance doesn't get erased or minimized in those narratives. Whether he succeeds in that mission probably depends as much on what he does in the rest of this Australian Open and beyond, as on his press conference responses. If he can somehow beat Sinner and win another major at 37 or 38, that becomes part of the legacy story. If he loses in the semifinals, the chasing Alcaraz and Sinner narrative gains more credibility. Sports are cruel that way. Your legacy is always being written and rewritten based on your most recent performances. And for aging champions, the ending of the story can sometimes overshadow the peak chapters. Djokovic knows this. It's probably part of why he reacted so strongly to the question. Because he can feel the narrative shifting, and he's fighting to control how that shift is described and understood. Novak Djokovic unleashed on a reporter during his Australian Open press conference after being asked a question that framed his entire career as chasing other players, first Federer and Nadal, now Alcaraz and Sinner. Make sure to watch until the end, because you'll be amazed at what really happened.